Welcome to Tucker Carlson Today. One of the biggest and least talked about changes in the country over the past couple of years, but particularly during COVID, is that everyone smokes weed now. It's not just kids, it's your friends. It might be your parents. Tons of older people are getting high in their houses. This is a huge change. The social sanctions against using marijuana have disappeared, and increasingly the legal sanctions have too. States across the country are legalizing recreational marijuana, not just medical marijuana, but smoking weed for fun. It's falling into the same category, less regulated in some ways, as alcohol. This is a civil rights issue, they tell us. It's an equity issue. You may be a racist if you oppose it. So this is a huge change. We're undoing 100 years of law and custom in a very short period of time. One of the natural results of this, as noted, is that many more people are smoking marijuana, and they're smoking a lot more of it. So what effects is this having, not just on the society, but on individuals? What happens if you smoke a lot of marijuana? It's interesting how few want to talk about that in any detail. It takes a brave person to stand up and ask those questions. Alex Berenson, who you're doubtless familiar with, for his work on COVID and our federal response to COVID, looked carefully into this question. In fact, he wrote a book about it a couple of years ago. The book is called Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. Alex Berenson joins us now to talk about this book. Alex Berenson, thanks so much for coming on.
Well, thank you. But before we get to this, I have to ask one question.
Yeah.
I did not know there was a different dress code for the podcast.
There is a different dress code. And I thought it was going to be a podcast, but somehow we wound up having cameras in the studio. And in fact, a studio. I imagined I was going to be sitting in my boxers in my bedroom on Zoom.
That's TMI.
Our producers were more ambitious anyway. But I'm really glad you're here. We talked to you a lot about COVID. I actually have a lot of questions about vaccines that, in fact, if we have time, I'm going to throw to you at the end of this conversation. But because of just the life that I live in this country, and doubtless you do too, I've noticed that people you would never imagine would be potheads, and I don't mean that pejoratively, suddenly are. And I don't just mean college kids, I mean people in their 50s.
Yes.
A lot of people are smoking marijuana. And so it struck me it might be a good moment to resurrect our conversation about your book, which I thought was really important, was unfortunately suppressed, really, and revisit the question of what does it mean to have a country where everyone's getting high all the time?
Sure. I mean, so yeah, you're right. There's clear evidence that that people are using more cannabis, and they're using it in some cases as a substitute for alcohol, in some cases as an addition. So older people, the use hasn't gone up quite as much as you think, because a lot of people will use once or twice, and they'll discover they don't really like it. It's,
right.
Or it's not what they were using 20 years ago or 30 years. It's much stronger, it's much more potent, and they wind up not using it. But certainly for, anybody under 25, I mean, the statistics are pretty clear. It's really beginning to displace alcohol. I mean, there's still a lot of alcohol consumption in that group, but there's a lot of cannabis and THC consumption.
So why I think that's interesting is because, once again, it's a huge change. And, some people are making the case, and I'm open-minded, that it's it's an upgrade from alcohol, and it'll make the country better. No one's really making the opposite case. And you came to my attention when you wrote this book. You're a well-known novelist. You were a well-known reporter before that. You're from a liberal world. I assume you're a liberal guy. And here you wrote this book saying, wait a second, maybe we should think through what the effects of all this weed smoking might be. Here's a clip from you from January 2019, which I guess is like over 2 years ago, coming on to talk about your book.
It turns out that there is a proven link between cannabis and psychosis. There's a very, very strong risk that if you smoke too much when you're in your teens, you're more likely to develop schizophrenia, which is really a devastating mental illness for people. Awful for not just for the people who suffer, but their families. It destroys families. And furthermore, there's a downstream link between psychosis and violence. So reefer madness basically is real. If you tell kids the truth about drug use and about addiction and harms, they'll respond.
Okay, so there you have it. You go on TV and you say, hey, actually, there is a provable connection between cannabis use and psychosis, schizophrenia, maybe the scariest disease there is, and kind of nobody responds.
Oh, no, there was a lot of response.
Tell us about a lot of response.
The response was, I don't know what I'm talking about, essentially. And I'm not a scientist, and how am I qualified to discuss any of this? The thing is, the book is pretty airtight. And the book, more than 2 years after it came out, continues to sell. I continue to get a lot of email from people, both users who've seen these problems in their own lives, and parents of users, and sometimes law enforcement officials. Here's the thing: schizophrenia, thankfully, is relatively uncommon.
Yes.
Major mental illness is relatively uncommon. So even if cannabis leads to a sharp increase in your risk should still be quite low.
Right.
So a lot of people can use a lot of cannabis, and it's going to take a long time before the effects are really visible on a population level basis. And so the people who advocate, for the legalization and the commercialization of cannabis can say, well, if this is so terrible, how come we don't see it? Okay. This is a little bit like a cigarette company in 1920 saying, where's all the lung cancer if cigarettes cause lung cancer? It can take a while. And by the way, the risk is not, it's not like the rate ratio for lung cancer in cigarettes, which might be 20 or 30 times.
Right.
It's lower than that, but it's still significant. Just to go back to your question about using and why people use, I think there's a couple reasons that kids and young adults like cannabis over alcohol. It's more discreet.
Yes.
You can do it all day. It doesn't leave you walking, stumbling around most of the time.
Right.
It doesn't, you can't smell it. Even though cannabis smells, the THC extracts don't smell.
Will you explain what that is for our few viewers who aren't hitting the dab pen? Sure. What are you talking about?
Sure. So most people who haven't used cannabis in a long time probably, it's a green leaf that you put in a bong or you wrap in a joint and you smoke. In fact, a huge amount of the cannabis that's consumed today is consumed as essentially pure or near pure THC, which is the chemical in cannabis that gets you high. So companies extract that from the leaf, and they put it in a liquid, or, which you can then vape, or you can eat it as an edible, either in a candy or directly on your tongue, and so this is a much different product, much more psychomimetic, much more likely to cause sort of short-term psychotic reactions than smoking a joint or two.
So you're saying that it's more dangerous in its broad effects over big populations to vape it, to heat the oil of pure THC than it is to smoke a joint?
Well, you can vape a lot more. Okay, so that's more dangerous, but actually edibles are more dangerous because of the way that the body processes them.
Huh.
So it's two different issues.
How is that?
Because they go through the liver and they get converted to something called delta 11 THC as opposed to delta 9 THC. The chemistry of THC is actually pretty complicated, and it looks like delta 11 THC is more powerful on the brain than delta 9. So you wind up with more of this compound that is stronger. And the other problem with edibles, and this is a joke that even users will acknowledge, is that they're hard to titrate. In other words, you're smoking, you get too high, you just stop, right? Or you might just even pass out, right, from smoking too much or vaping too much. If you use an edible, it can take 30 minutes, an hour and a half. So the joke is, nothing's happening, I'll have another one. Nothing's happening, I'll have another one. Nothing's happening. Get me to the emergency room now.
Yeah. I think everybody knows a kind of middle-aged, affluent couple who was going skiing in Vail for the weekend, eating too many gummies and wound up really sick.
That's right. So the product is more dangerous. It gets you higher. There's this myth that the drug legalization community in general likes to say, which is that prohibition drives strengthening of product use. So they always talk about alcohol, and the original prohibition, people drank more hard liquor and less beer. But alcohol is different because alcohol, you have to drink. Alcohol is titrated by the ounce or the keg, right? It takes a lot of alcohol, low potency alcohol, to get you drunk.
Right.
This stuff is titrated by the milligram. So in other words, it's pretty easy to smuggle enough cannabis to get you high without a tanker truck being required. And so it turns out that user demand drives higher potency. People want to get high quickly, whether it's fentanyl versus morphine or THC versus cannabis. So this notion that commercialization will make products less dangerous rather than more turns out not to be the case in reality. But here's the other reason that kids and young adults and even adults have been moving towards alcohol. I mean, most people know that, moving towards cannabis. Most people know that alcohol can be dangerous, right? You drink too much, you're drunk driving. Certainly, there's an association between alcohol use and domestic violence. It's bad for your liver, you gain weight. There's even a cancer risk associated with heavy alcohol consumption, which a lot of people don't know, but which is true. And cannabis is sold as medicine. One of the terrible things, the many terrible things that the cannabis lobby has done in the last 20 years is pretend that cannabis is medicine rather than a recreational product. And that's why, as much as I dislike the move towards full legalization, it's better than this netherworld of pretending it's medicine. Because when you pretend it's medicine, especially when you pretend it's medicine for psychiatric conditions like insomnia or depression or anxiety, you wind up with exactly the wrong people using it. You wind up with, to the extent it's safe the way alcohol is safe. It's safe, you want to go out and have a good time, you have a moderate amount and you have fun, or with cannabis, maybe you sit at home and you watch Netflix and it's a little funnier than it would otherwise be or whatever. When you market it as medicine, you get people using it all day, every day, telling themselves that they're curing, in many cases, either pain or some psychiatric illness, when in reality, very quickly, this is an addictive product, which again is something that the cannabis lobby has lied about for a long time, because it's not physically addictive. But it's very psychologically addictive, and that's true of cocaine. Okay, cocaine is not physically addictive.
That's right.
But people who use it will tell you it's pretty hard to stop.
What's so interesting? You mentioned cocaine. You point out that marijuana has been marketed as a medicine. Cocaine was marketed as a medicine.
Yes, it was.
In one of the first Arthur Conan Doyle stories. I think it's a sign of 4.
It was originally
he
used.
describes injecting cocaine as medicine. Heroin famously was a medicine. Tobacco was a medicine.
That's right.
Has there ever been a drug that wasn't a medicine?
No, I mean alcohol was during Prohibition you could get a doctor's note to use alcohol. And alcohol has medicinal qualities. It's a good muscle relaxant.
Well, so does nicotine.
That's right. But we don't pretend that people are using them as medicines. But for 20 years, we've pretended this about cannabis, and people have gotten very, very confused.
What does it do to the integrity of the medical establishment when you do that?
It's not good.
No.
Look, and doctors, they're really caught, especially psychiatrists, okay? They see the problems that heavy use has caused and is causing. But they don't want to talk about it. It's uncomfortable for them, and this has been framed as a social justice issue. One big platform of the legalization lobby is, it's medicine, and they point to all these nonsense studies showing, various medicinal uses, which never or almost never hold up when you try to do randomized controlled trials to actually prove, beyond anecdote that these work. But it's also, there's huge racial disparities in arrests here.
Yeah.
Okay. So that used to be more true than it is. But even when it was very true, very, very few people wound up in jail or prison for cannabis, possession or even low-level dealing. That was true even 15 years ago.
I thought we sent millions to jail for having a joint in the ashtray.
Yeah, that's totally untrue. In most, maybe in the South there's a handful of people still in jail for simple possession, although even in those cases, it would often be a plea bargain to something else. But I'm not going to say there's none, because there are a few probably still. But for you to do significant prison time for moving cannabis, you have to be moving cannabis by not just the trunk load, but probably the truckload. I'm sure somebody out there will find a case that that contradicts that. But for the most part, that is true. So again, I'm not going to say there's no racial equity issues here. I'm going to say that they've been vastly overstated. When you look at what really has happened, even in pre-legalization in the last 15 or 20
years. And yet it's
years.
a pretext for the changes. I wonder if we can play a clip from the governor of Virginia, Ralph Northam, who's a physician, famously, explaining why legalization is coming to the Commonwealth of Virginia. Here he is.
Virginia is proud. We'll be the 16th state to legalize the recreational use of marijuana. And as a physician, This is something that we started working on 2 years ago by expanding the medicinal use of marijuana. Last year, we decriminalized marijuana. We did 2 very thorough studies over the last year, and we know the time is right, and we want to do it right in Virginia, and we can. So we'll be the 16th state to legalize the recreational use of marijuana. And, you know, it's an equity issue for Virginia, among other things. We know that blacks and whites use marijuana at the same rate, but blacks are 3 to 4 times more likely to be arrested and convicted. So this is wrong, and we're going to right a wrong and take that step in Virginia.
Boy, he's kind of taking up a moral cudgel here. He's saying that this is, as he put it, an equity issue, meaning a racial justice issue, I think. And the implication is, of course, if you oppose it, then you're on the wrong side of a racial justice issue, yes, which, of course, you don't want to be. How would you assess that?
Well, again, he's vastly overstating, how many people wind up in prison. Now, look, you can say that an arrest is an unpleasant experience, and it's unfair if black people are being arrested more than white people. The truth is, use is pretty similar among blacks and whites. That's true. There is evidence that black people tend to use more heavily. That if you look at cannabis use disorder, which is using so much that it's problematic, that rate tends to be higher for blacks than whites, which is something that almost nobody ever talks about. I'm not saying that explains the whole distinction.
Yes.
But it is probably part of it. The other thing is that in black communities, and I don't know if this is changing, but people don't really want, kids, or since, older people don't really want kids necessarily smoking pot on the street. So sometimes they'll call the police too, people who live in those communities, because they view it as a sign of disorder. Now, again, I'm not saying that fully explains the distinction, but there is some of that. Interestingly, in New York State now, which has moved to full legalization, because Governor Cuomo will do anything not to be impeached right now, and the progressives in New York have all the power.
That's what happened to Ralph Northam. He gets caught wearing blackface, and all of a sudden he becomes the pawn of radicals because his job is on the line.
Yes, and so in New York, I don't think police will not be able to approach you if you're smoking cannabis in the street. Now, they can approach you if you're drinking in the street. That's you can be arrested for that. But smoking cannabis is going to be allowed.
Seriously?
Yeah, so it will be preferential. So look, here's the thing. I think even people who are in the cannabis community will acknowledge that cannabis can cause, a fair number of people, especially if you use heavily, to have kind of short-term psychotic reactions, right? A bad trip.
But they're peaceful, though, because marijuana makes you peaceful.
Yeah.
It's the Mahatma Gandhi drug.
That's right. That's why violence has gone down so much in the United States in the last 5 years.
So you think that there is, I'm just being completely honest. I grew up in Southern California. I smoked marijuana as a child. Everyone I knew believed that it mellowed you out. So you're saying there's evidence of the opposite.
Oh, yeah. There's something called cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, okay? What that basically means is uncontrolled vomiting as a result of THC use.
Yes, I've seen that.
Now, cannabis is supposed to settle your stomach. If you're nauseated, smoke some, right? That was sort of one of the famous uses of it.
Of course.
For chemotherapy.
For chemo patients,
That's right. But it looks like there's this paradoxical effect if you use too much of it, that for whatever reason, somehow it resets the receptors in the brain for some people, and they have this just terrible uncontrolled vomiting that in some cases can actually kill. I'm not exaggerating, because you become so dehydrated, it can kill you if you're not careful, if you don't get to an emergency room. So paradoxically, so in the short term, marijuana can reduce anxiety, certainly, and it can get you high. But like most anti-anxiety drugs, you can have bad rebound anxiety if you try to quit.
Yes.
That's true of benzodiazepines too. That's a known risk. Okay.
Yes.
Further, cannabis has this effect on people where it makes them paranoid. Some people, some of the time. Okay. And if you have this predisposition, or if you're sliding into mental illness and you start smoking a lot, you may sort of temporarily muffle that anxiety at the cost of your paranoid symptoms getting worse. And there's been a fair amount of research done into what causes people with severe mental illness to become violent, because this is something, again, this is why I'm an annoyance to the mental illness community, mental health professionals, because they hate talking about this, even though they know it's true. Psychosis is a very severe risk for violence, possibly the most sort of severe single risk. Okay, people who are psychotic commit serious violent crime at rates, depending on the crime, anywhere from 2 to 20 times the average person. Okay, and the more severe the violence, the higher the differential. Okay, so when you look at what drives that risk, it's paranoia more than anything else, and that makes intuitive sense,
of course,
right?
it does.
If you feel someone is a threat to you,
yes,
they're controlling your mind, or they are the devil, or whatever it is, you will feel justified in lashing out at them.
Yes.
And so a drug that induces paranoia, while at the same time sort of muffling your symptoms visibly for a while, can make you very dangerous. Okay, and so when you look at heavy users of cannabis, especially those with underlying mental illness, their risk of violence is very high. Okay, and again, that doesn't mean that the person who uses once a month or once a week as to get high as a substitute for drinking, or as a supposed medicinal use, is at that risk. But it does mean that if you're using heavily and you have underlying mental illness, there's a problem. There's a potential problem, I should say.
So probably the most memorable crime in the last decade took place, I believe, in 2012 in Miami. I think it was under a bridge, where a homeless guy grabbed a man and ate part of his face. He was a cannibal. He was famously, and so everyone reading this said, well, how the hell did that? I mean, that's so horrifying. We wanted to know the details, and we learned that this homeless man had been smoking something called bath salts, which most of us never heard of, that were a kind of crypto-legal compound sold in convenience stores. There was a whole series of stories about this. You tweeted something the other day that kind of shocked me. Not the first time you shocked me with your tweets. Here's what you wrote. Quote, "Fun fact, the 2012 Miami bath salts attack was a cannabis-only case. If you say I'm wrong on this, I'm just going to block you. The facts are unequivocal, and I have no patience for people who won't accept reality anymore." This was a couple of days ago. What?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, they checked his blood. He didn't have any, and you can look for all these designer hallucinogens. He didn't have any of those. He had cannabis. High strength, high potency THC is plenty psychomimetic for most people. Okay, it is a dissociative drug, and it can cause paranoia, and it can lead you almost to a full-blown trip if you're using a lot of it regularly.
That is true.
Yeah.
So given that, I'm very repetitive. I like to ask the same questions over and over again. Why in the world are we not talking about this?
Because the cannabis lobby wants the drug legal, and drug reform advocates want it legal, and this is not a way to get it legalized. You get it legalized by talking about how it's racially unjust that it's illegal, and how it's going to generate all this revenue, and how it has all these medicinal qualities, and how it's much safer than alcohol, and how if alcohol is legal, and how, drunk driving kills all these people, but when people are stoned, all they do is drive slowly and carefully. That's nonsense too. In fact, in Washington and Colorado, which are the two states that recreationally legalized first, there was a big jump in driving deaths in the last 7-8 years. And you can see that many of those deaths, cannabis was the only drug used. And I can point you anecdotally to many cases where people were driving triple-digit speeds. Again, because if you have a reaction where you're getting paranoid, maybe you want to get home as quickly as possible.
And I think most recreational marijuana smokers or users have had that experience. That's kind of a famous byproduct of regular marijuana smoking, is you get paranoid.
That's right.
That's not new fact. So I guess that I'm just fascinated by the psychology, but your psychology to be specific. Why would you write this book? I mean, you're a well-respected person in your community. You've had an impressive career. You're a famous novelist. Like, the last thing you need is to write a book about marijuana at a moment where it's very unfashionable to say what you're saying. Why would you do this?
Well, my wife is a psychiatrist, and she's a forensic psychiatrist. That means she deals with the criminally mentally ill. And I mean, she really encouraged me to do this. She encouraged me to look at the science around it. And I used cannabis a few times in college, or shortly thereafter. Not very many. It didn't really agree with me. It's not my drug.
Yeah.
And so I didn't have much of an opinion on legalization. I say this in the book, and it's true. I sort of, this is coming, and we're moving towards sort of a more libertarian society in a lot of ways. Gay marriage, this, that, and the other. Yeah. This is coming with it. Who cares, really? I'm not going to use it, but who cares? But once I realized that this risk wasn't just theoretical, but that it had effectively been proven by many different studies conducted over many different years, and that there was sort of a biological plausibility to it. I thought to myself, how is it that, I covered the drug industry for the New York Times for years. How is it that I had no idea that this was real? And if I don't know it's real, then I think a lot of people aren't going to know it's real.
Yeah.
So I decided I would write the book.
So your wife brought this to you, this story, basically?
She did, because of what she had seen. Psychiatrists know this, and forensic psychiatrists certainly know this. Okay, and then the more I looked, the worse it got. Okay, so there are states like Florida and Texas that actually look at root causes of child deaths. Okay, child deaths from abuse and neglect, and what you find is that the drug that is associated with parental or caregiver use far more than any other, including alcohol, is cannabis. Okay, that for look, killing your child or allowing your child to starve to these terrible cases, okay, you have to be pretty dissociated and pretty mentally ill to do that most of the time. And so, I mean, again, anecdotally, when you read the cases, they're horrible, but people just descend into this madness that allows them to behave impossibly cruelly to their children. I mean, again, people are going to hear this and think, oh, look at the cases, okay? The number one thing you can do, if you don't believe me, is read the cases. Or
talk to parents. The number of parents you meet who say, well, it sounds like BS, but actually I have a child who's addicted to marijuana. Or that's a real thing.
Oh, that's a real thing. Oh no, I mean, yeah, I'm sort of talking about the thin people. I could have made my life easier, okay? I could have talked more sort of generally about, this isn't great for your school, and, this isn't great for memory or concentration. You certainly can get addicted to this. It looks very much like this is a gateway, and there's sort of good both mechanistic and cultural reasons to believe that. By going to the violence, issue, I made it easier for people who hate talking about any of this to dismiss me. But the fact is, it's in some ways the most important part of it because it's the least understood part of it, and people need to know.
And it has the most profound consequences. So you've written a dozen-ish books. You certainly know the publishing business well. You know what a trajectory of a book looks like. Tell us, what was your experience with this book?
So it was pretty fascinating. I didn't know whether we would get reviews or not. I mean, obviously I felt we should get reviews, but I knew that there were places that weren't going to want to review this. And then a couple weeks, I had sent the book to Malcolm Gladwell, who I didn't know at all, but I thought, Malcolm's an independent thinker.
Yeah.
He might be interested.
Mr. Counterintuition.
Exactly. If anybody, is going to bite, and Malcolm's got a big platform, anyway.
At the New Yorker.
At the New Yorker. And it turned out he was going to write something. And actually for a while I thought, oh no, he's going to rewrite the book and not give me any credit for it. No, he was really nice about it. He wrote a nice piece. It didn't say I totally agree with this, but it was a nice piece. And it mentioned the book in some detail. So under normal, and that was a couple days before the book came out. So under normal circumstances, what would happen then is New York Times and the Washington Post. And you get a lot of reviews, okay? Instead, what happened was there was essentially a coordinated campaign by overtly woke media outlets like Vice and Vox and other places to discredit the book, not neutral reviewers. And so there were, you can go look and see what was written about the book, which, normally I think when you review a book, you sort of take the author's facts as a given, and you talk about how he presents his case, and maybe you say, well, there are other people who disagree with this, but the point of the review is not to sort of go toe to toe with the facts in the book. That's what happened here. These were in no way neutral reviews. They were intentionally and openly designed to discredit the book, and then the places where there should have been neutral reviews just ignored it. And I lost interviews, scheduled interviews with NPR and other places where they said, we're just not going to have you on. And it's like, you know what, have me on and ask me whatever you like. Ask me, if I'm a meth addict who, hates pot because it competes for the meth industry. Ask me whatever you like. No, they would not have me on. They just, the places that couldn't ignore the book, they sort of leftist woke outlets, savaged it. But what was so disappointing to me was places like the Times wouldn't review it, wouldn't sort of assign somebody who wasn't from the industry or wasn't from the anti drug lobby to somebody neutral to just read the book and say, hey, does this present an interesting case to me?
What's the anti-drug lobby? I don't notice they exist anymore. There used to be.
There really isn't one. Look, this has been a very, very savvy and coordinated campaign, not just about cannabis, but really about all illegal drugs. That's been going on for 25 years now. That has won. Okay, it's won on cannabis, and they are pushing psychedelics. I don't know if they will be willing to push heroin and cocaine because those drugs are so obviously dangerous to a lot of users, but they may. Okay. And cannabis is clearly sort of the camel's nose in the tent, which is one reason, yet another reason why they hate the book so much, because it says, they've been saying, oh, the cannabis legalization's gone great. Look at all this tax revenue. There's been no problems. And here I am saying, why don't we look at like psychiatric admissions for, kids? And why don't we look at murder trends in the states that legalized early? And, why don't we try to actually do a big picture look rather than just saying, oh, the state of Colorado gets $300 million a year from this. Let me tell you, $300 million a year doesn't go that far when the cost of hospitalizing somebody, right, for severe mental illness is, $10,000 or more for a week.
No, it's totally right. It's just interesting. When I was a kid, we were bombarded with anti-drug messages, which, to be candid, I didn't take very seriously. Wish I had, but we didn't. And it was all kind of dopey middle-aged people. Don't do drugs, or the president's wife. Just say no, all that stuff. And I always kind of made fun of it. I wish I hadn't. But now you wake up as a 51-year-old man and it's all gone. Patrick Kennedy, whom I despised. I despised when he served in the Congress from Rhode Island. I thought he was a buffoon. Wound up getting sober and becoming a completely different person and a very decent man, a very nice man. Had all these children, a happy marriage, and he has this kind of remarkable story of how he personally was transformed. And I saw it. I doubt we, agree on abortion or whatever, but he's a good person who wants to help people. He is not allowed to serve in the anti-drug office in the administration because he's against marijuana. We had him on. Here's what he said.
We almost have a perfect storm for people wanting to consume marijuana. I mean, let's be honest, it's a very anxious time. But as a nation, we ought to be thinking about the long-term impact of this. Some people might say marijuana isn't as addictive as OxyContin or isn't as addictive as alcohol, but it's all about degrees. The fact of the matter is, we know if a young adolescent who's suffering from stress and anxiety uses marijuana, it's going to make them feel better. And if they're anything like me, and if there's just a percentage of them that are prone to be addicted, have the disease of addiction, then we're going to see that many more people ultimately suffer the disease of addiction in their lives. And I know it is a plague. I know addiction is a plague.
Boy, so here you have one of the most liberal members of Congress. He's a Kennedy. He's Ted Kennedy's son, saying, I was an addict. I know the misery that causes. I want to save other people from that. And people look at Patrick Kennedy and say he's just a right-wing crazy. What?
By the way, cannabis is not as addictive as, heroin, but it's more addictive than alcohol. It's clearly more addictive if you look at the studies.
Really?
Yeah, daily users versus overall users. And a lot of this, people who drink all day, we have a name for them, right? We call them alcoholics. They don't usually talk about it, but people will happily tell you that they smoke all day, right? They wake and bake.
Oh, yeah.
And, again, because the impairment is sort of more subtle, people will do it for long periods of time.
But it's profound.
It's profound. That's right. And I personally know. I think most people. No, I don't know most people, but many people who are adults can think of people whose lives have essentially stopped because of cannabis use.
Yes.
It's sort of this. I never got married. I quit my job when I was 35, and I sort of get by. And there's a fair amount of that going on.
It seems to sap your essential spirit. I'm not being precise. I'm not a man of science, but I think I'm observant, and I've seen that, where whatever that is, that life force that propels you forward to create, is dulled.
Right. Now, listen, I would say that the libertarian in me says, that's your choice. Okay.
Well, I agree, actually.
If you feel your life is better, sort of coasting through, and you are not hurting anybody else, and especially you don't have kids, you're not married, you don't have any obligations except sort of to society, but you can, as long as you're not hurting anybody, that's your choice. I think it's a bad choice.
But I tend to agree with that.
Right.
But why don't we just describe what's true? Let's just start there. Like, maybe you should know before you embark on it.
That's right. But yeah, I mean, it's like we're not allowed to talk about that happening. And here's the problem, okay? Some percentage of those people, we don't know how many, will descend into full-on mental illness. I mean, schizophrenia is usually considered a disease that develops in your 20s. Your early 20s if you're male, a little later if you're female. There's sort of this clear progression.
Yes.
And the earlier it begins, the worse your prognosis most of the time. But psychiatrists are increasingly seeing this sort of late onset, schizophrenia, or something that looks a lot like schizophrenia.
Really?
Yeah. And I'm not saying that it's common, okay, but I'm saying they are seeing more cases
people in their
of it.
30s?
Yeah, people in their 30s and 40s kind of sliding into mental illness, severe mental illness, psychosis, and not being able to get out even after they quit using.
I've never heard of that.
Yes, it's rare, but it's not, it is happening. And so, look, to break a fully formed mind takes a long time and a lot of abuse.
To break a fully formed mind takes a long time and a lot of abuse. So I want to ask, this book comes out in the winter of 2019. Exactly 1 year later, COVID emerges.
Yes.
And your life takes this amazing and obviously unforeseen turn where you become the country's foremost skeptic of conventional views on COVID.
Yes.
And that has completely defined your life for the last almost year and a half.
Yes.
I think it's fair to say.
Yes.
So here's why I just think it's so interesting. Tell us how, and our viewers are primarily familiar with you from your work on COVID. How did your experience with this book, writing about science, in effect, inform your decision to become an analyst of COVID?
So that's a great question, because there is a direct link. So the book comes out, and it's savaged, and but I'm continuing to read papers, and meanwhile I'm writing a novel which came out a couple months ago. But weirdly, that was 2019. As I'm, Tell Your Children is out, and I'm sort of continuing to do work and questioning my own, questioning my priors, as scientists like to say. Did I make mistakes here? Did I miss something? And I didn't find the arguments against the science in the book compelling. Okay, again, you can argue the drug should be legal.
Right.
For all these other reasons.
There are many layers. There's a moral argument, there's a what's best for society, there's a scientific
There's
argument.
a libertarian, but the science, I found the scientific arguments profoundly unconvincing. And more papers came out, okay? Research was done on the children of pregnant women who'd used that was striking and disturbing.
What did it find?
It found that they had increased levels, this was at age 11, of sort of psychotic symptomology. So you're not going to have psychosis in an 11-year-old unless the person is sort of profoundly disturbed and deranged. But you can ask them questions that show that they might be on that path. Do you think everyone at school is laughing at you? Do you think people can control what you're thinking? Stuff like that. And the children of women who'd used scored significantly higher on those questions than the children of women who hadn't. So we'll have to see what happens. It's a very big study called the ABCD study, which there'll be more data from in the coming years. And in fact, just a couple months ago, a paper came out, because there's always this argument of reverse causation. In other words, I'm getting mentally ill, that's why I'm smoking.
Right. And
so these Dutch physicians and scientists did a very carefully constructed study where they showed that the cause, not only were you 7 times as likely to show signs of psychosis after using, but if you were showing signs of psychosis in the next period, you were about half as likely to use. So there was actually some evidence that people were trying to pull back. In other words, there were people
because they felt themselves going crazy.
That's right. So some people, the self-medication, that just blows the self-medication hypothesis out of the water.
Yes, it does.
And so the book comes out, it gets savaged this way, and I realize, I'm not getting a fair hearing here, okay? And I know that people at the Times know who I am. I worked there, and not just that, go look at the stories that I wrote for over a 10-year period. It was mostly, bashing, not bashing, I shouldn't say bashing, but, going after drug companies, investigating drug companies, investigating Halliburton, okay?
Yeah.
Investigating, Bernie Madoff, all this stuff. Serious, investigative, financial, and business journalism. That was my bread and butter at the New York Times. So I didn't change. Okay, I switched to a topic that you didn't like. And I came up with findings that you didn't like. And so now I'm suddenly an ideologue. Nonsense. I'm not an ideologue any more than I was. I'm just talking about something you wish weren't true. Okay. So, COVID.
Did that blow your mind?
It was upsetting.
Were you surprised by it?
I was a little surprised at the Times. I thought I deserved a little bit better because I knew the people there knew me.
Yeah.
But it is what it is.
But it kind of calls into question not simply one newspaper, but like our whole system. If you have a system that is resistant to facts it doesn't care to see, it's not the system you thought it was.
That's true. I mean, that's COVID. Okay, so this mysterious illness that starts showing up in January 2020, and I'm interested in biological warfare and all that, because it's spy novels and all this stuff. So I'm pretty early on COVID, and pretty scared of it actually. In January, you can look.
So was I.
Right?
Yeah, we did a bunch of stories. I'm interested in the same stuff, and I thought, whoa, this
doesn't look good.
Exactly.
Right? And then and then it goes to Italy, and Italy shuts down, and all of a sudden it's everywhere. And then one day, the Imperial College London puts out this paper saying, 2 million Americans are going to die unless we shut down the whole economy for at least 18 months, or until we get a vaccine, because they thought a vaccine back then was going to take at least 18 months, because they didn't know about warp speed. So, which is nice for science fiction, but not for drug development. Okay, Tucker. So this paper comes out and it scares the whole world. It scares all the politics. Neil Ferguson must be, he must be very good. He's a very seductive guy, as we know.
Yeah. You're alluding to the famous story in which, while he was calling for lockdowns of everyone else, he was sneaking out to see his girlfriend.
No, it's worse than that, Tucker. He actually had COVID at the time, and she was coming to see him. That's true.
I'm laughing. It's just so unbelievable.
It's unbelievable. So this paper comes out, and there's this little chart in the middle of it, and it shows the sort of predicted deaths by age. And all of a sudden, I'm like, wait a minute, this is not the Spanish flu. 90, I can't remember what the exact numbers were. I have to go back and look, but 90 or 95% of the deaths are in the over 70 group, or the assumed ratio of risk here is 100 times or 1,000 times, again, I'd have to go back and look, older people over 70 than people under 18.
Right.
Okay, so what kind of plague is this if it's only really affecting people over 70?
We should say in the Spanish flu, and I believe this is true, I just read it, that the most vulnerable demographic was young mothers. So if you were 24 and had just had your first baby, you were the most likely to die.
That's right. It was a W. So young, sort of 0 to 5, and then young adults, men and women, and then elderly people, which is one reason it was so awful, right? Because kids were dying, by the score from the Spanish flu. And and then a couple weeks later, Neil Ferguson spoke in testimony this is in March of 2020, to the British Parliament, and the scales are sort of dropping from my eyes day by day as I'm reading more and more and more.
And you're just following this as a civilian at home.
That's right. This
is not your job.
No. I mean, I was, as my wife reminded me very much at that time, it was not my job and I was not getting paid for it. And so
you're a novelist who's working on a novel.
No, at that point I was sort of working. I want to write a bigger book about the drug legalization and sort of about drugs and why we shouldn't legalize them.
Yes.
I want to sort of present that because the legalizers have seized the moral high ground, right? There's all these anti-drug ads. You shouldn't use meth, you shouldn't use cocaine. But somewhere along the way, the strategic vision for why drug use is harmful as a proposition has been forgotten. No one will say that. And this is what you were saying, that like Partnership for Drug-Free America doesn't really talk about a drug-free America, right? So anyway, that was the book that I was working on in the winter of 2020. But slowly, not even slowly, quickly, my attention got sort of tugged to COVID. And so Neil Ferguson, in testimony before the British Parliament, this was not a secret, suddenly changed his estimate for the number of deaths in Britain from 500,000 to 25,000. That's a 95% decrease. Okay, and it was even lower. I think it was 7 to 25,000 or 7 to 20,000. I can again go back and check that, but it was an enormous decrease. Okay, and no one in the American press mentions this, even though it's only 10 days before that the Imperial College London paper had frightened the world. Okay, so the question one is, why did Neil Ferguson make this massive change?
Yeah.
And it turns out that it's effectively because he thought that the virus had spread much more widely already than we'd realized, meaning that more people had been infected and recovered than we'd realized, meaning that the death count, meaning that it was less, lethal than we'd thought. By the way, Ferguson managed to be wrong both ways. He was actually too low. Which no one's ever pointed out. But so the second question, and almost more important question, was, why are we talking about this? And why are we talking about who's really at risk here? And why are we trying to frighten 18-year-olds? And what does it mean if we're going to shut the country down for months and months on end if the people who are really at risk here are 70 and older? What should we be doing? And why is the public health establishment not being honest about this? And why is the media not being honest about this? And why is the New York Times saying that, we're going to need 100,000 ventilators? I mean, the Times said that 100,000 people might be on ventilators, and that, the Trump administration had failed. There weren't enough ventilators. There was no stockpile. We needed to nationalize ventilator production. When the Society for Critical Care, right, the people who, the pulmonologists and the pulmonary nurses, the people who actually had to run the ventilator, said, there's no way on earth we can make that work because we don't have nearly enough people to man that. If that happens, we are truly SOL.
Yeah.
Okay. But the Times saw a way to bash Donald Trump. I mean, it was very, very clear to me that, look, there was fear in New York City in March of 2020. I was there, okay, I know, and in April. But it was very, very clear early on that the media also saw this as a great way to make sure Donald Trump wasn't going to be reelected. That, that this pandemic played to his weaknesses, right? He's not very empathetic. He shoots from the hip. He doesn't.
Right.
He talks without knowing what he's saying. That is not who you want then, right? When times are good, you can live with that, and some people might even like it. But the circus isn't fun when there's a funeral next door.
Right.
And so they saw that they could beat him with this, and they did over and over and over again. And month by month, it got worse and worse because, look, by early April of last year, and we talked about this, you could see that this was not going to destroy society. Not that people weren't going to die, not that it wasn't going to be serious, but that this was fundamentally a medical problem that mainly we had to make sure that the short-term surges weren't going to overwhelm hospitals. Okay, that was the key. And that everything else we could sort of go on with our lives. And again, if the hospitals, and there were going to be times when the regional hospital system was going to be stressed, as, by the way, sometimes happens with the flu. And I can point you to stories from Southern California in 2017 and 2011 where they're talking about hospitals being stressed by the flu. Okay, and as happens in Italy sometimes, hospitals get stressed by the flu. It's, you can't run a whole second hospital system just for the one time a year when there's a flu epidemic or a COVID epidemic. So there is going to be stress. But that doesn't mean that the correct answer is to shut down society. And so what what Tell Your Children taught me was, once the media consensus forms, if it forms hard, it becomes very, very hard from inside that system to present facts that don't go along with that point of view.
As someone who's spent his life inside the media, I mean, was this a shock to you?
Well, it kind of, I mean,
when you were working at the New York Times.
I wasn't a political reporter. Okay, first of all.
Of course, but it's not accusatory. I worked at CNN, NBC News, ABC, PBS. I mean, I spent my whole life in that too. But I wonder, had you ever thought, like, here I am, a reporter at a big metropolitan daily, I'm affecting part of a machine that affects, like, the way the country sees itself and understands reality.
So I remember being in Las Vegas in 2003, and somebody said to me, and I just got back from Iraq. I'd been, in Iraq for a couple months for the paper, and he said, he said it must be, he's a Republican, I assume. He said it must be hard for them to, to work there and have them tell you what to write. And I said, you don't have a clue. And I was mad because I put my life on the line. I said, they don't tell us what to write. We go out and find stories and we write them, and we do our best to make sure that our version of reality is real. That was how I viewed my job at the New York Times, and I never felt really constrained. Okay, I mean, again, I was chasing companies. I was afflicting or comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable, or I was trying to. Okay, and again, I am proud of my work at the New York Times, and I challenge anybody on either side to see that to find problems in it, because there aren't. I'm not going to say there aren't any, but there are very, very few. Okay, I'm proud of my work at the Times, but A, I wasn't covering politics, and B, and perhaps more importantly, or race or any real hot button issue. Biz Day was sort of off to the side so we could do our own thing. The Times has changed a lot, especially in the last 5 years. And, as with so many other things, you can blame Donald Trump, right? But they became overtly, where they had been sort of, we are on the left and, look, maybe in our choice of story selection, it's going to tend towards things that Democrats might want to read more than Republicans. Okay, comfort the afflicted, afflict the comfortable. But once the story is assigned, or once you get out there and write it, you write it to the best of your ability. You try to write it fairly. You let the subject, if the person is just, if you're going after the person, have a say, and try to present their point of view fairly. I think all that stuff is basically out the window now. That it is essentially an openly leftist publication that doesn't believe in fairness. And I don't think they'll necessarily lie openly. I don't think they've gone there. Okay, I don't want to say that about the Times, and I don't believe it. But I think that they will present a version of reality that is, that is extremely slanted in a way that would never have been allowed before.
And they will exclude data, facts that might cut against the story they want to tell.
That's right. So you write about the ventilators, and you don't point out that there's no possible way on earth that we could do anything with 100,000 ventilators. And then 3 weeks later, when it turns out that New York State needed, I think they topped out at 4,500 ventilators. They'd said they were going to need 40,000. You don't ever come back to that story. You don't ever admit that the projections were way off. Instead, you find something new to bash Donald Trump about, which in mid-April was that we didn't have enough tests. And then it was that we didn't have enough masks, or that he was anti-mask. Like, you just move on.
But so most people in your position would realize, all right, the things that I'm working on are in direct opposition to the story that everyone else is telling, including my former colleagues and probably friends.
Or
and
ex-friends.
You can't fight City Hall, and if I want a future in this country, I'm going to shut up or go along. But you decide to unholster both middle fingers and wag them right in the face of the most powerful people in the world. So very few other people did that. Why did you do that?
Well, I was fortunate enough. First of all, I'd been paid pretty well for my novels over the years, and I don't have super fancy taste or anything like that.
And there are plenty of rich people joining the mob right now, like a lot.
Look, I guess I'm a contrarian by nature, but I also believed everything I said was true. I don't write stuff that. Look, I make mistakes, okay? But I don't write stuff that's not true. This is not a grift for me. It's not a game for me. And I believe that the more people who, if the media had gone the other way, okay, and said, COVID is nothing, it's fine, don't worry about it, you probably would have found me saying, look, this kills some people. We should write about that. We should be aware of that. That's not what happened. And the political motivations became, it's funny. I watched that thing with John Oliver where he said, you said that the election was stolen, but you didn't say that. You said the election was rigged.
Yeah.
Those are two different things.
Oh, I know.
And so as it became more and more clear to me that, and it was the schools as much as anything that crystallized this, okay? Because it was clear by late April, early May that the schools should be open, that we were hurting kids, and we were hurting the poorest, most vulnerable kids the most. Yeah. Because those are the kids, who, they need school. They need to get out of their houses and have somebody looking at them. And, they need a chance. Even a bad school is better than no school, you would hope. And if you're rich and your kid's not going to school, you get a pod, or you send them to private school, or if you're really, you hire a tutor for them. You make it work. These kids, it's not being made work nothing was working for them.
Yeah, they're not weathering this in Amagansett.
That's right. That's right. And so I started saying that, and the Times started writing these ludicrous stories about how, kids were at tremendous risk from this post-COVID syndrome. And, right now, the best data is that about 180 kids had COVID. I mean, under 18. So not, 70 million people in that age range had COVID on their death certificates. At least a third of those were like homicide or suicide or something completely unrelated to COVID. So you're down to under 120 kids, which over the course of 2 flu seasons is fewer than kids that would die in 2 flu seasons. But even more than that, when you look at the death certificates of people, of children who've died of COVID, they are profoundly ill. Okay, it turns out that this virus, wherever it came from, we'll just go into that topic later, wherever it came from, isn't very good at making kids sick. And kids should be in school. And the Times refused to admit that for months and months and months. And they really drove the agenda. I mean, it is funny to be on the outside and see how powerful. The Times sets the agenda more than any other news organization, maybe more than all the other news organizations combined. I'm not even sure why it's so powerful, but it is. And its power doesn't seem diminished. No, if anything, I think because there was a period, when the Washington Post was cutting back and, the Journal was really becoming very business focused and doing less non-business reporting, and the Times' voice grew. It was the only game in town. Now the Post, although the Post is even further to the left than the Times, but, at least there's a second voice out there. So the Times is incredibly powerful. And, people say, well, you used to work there, don't you want to go back? And I say, it's not just that the ship has sailed, the ship has sunk to the bottom of the sea, and the sea has been, it exploded with a volcano and sent into space. Like,